Welcome everyone to Berkeley Unbound, the Bay Area Book Festival's one-day virtual mini-festival. I'm Shanthi Sekaran, and I'll be your moderator for this wonderful discussion titled Writing a New World into Existence. Joining me first is Aya De Leon. She's a professor at UC Berkeley, director of Poetry for the People, and award-winning author of the Justice Hustlers feminist heist novels. Second here, we have Annalee Newitz, a science journalist and founder of the website IO9, lecturer at UC Berkeley, and award-winning author of A Future of Another Timeline, and the forthcoming Four Lost Cities. And finally, we have Ishmael Reed, a National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize finalist, with over 30 books published, including the groundbreaking work Mumbo Jumbo, and founder of the For Columbus Foundation and PEN Oakland. So thank you for being here, all three of you. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be talking to you. I'm really excited about this topic that we have on hand today, writing towards a new future, using literature and fiction in particular to address issues of social equity, to address what we want to see changed in this world. It feels like we have something new coming at us from the world every day, and fiction and literature and writing, they continue to play such a strong role in helping artists and helping the public negotiate the world in which we live. So thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk. I'm going to start with Aya. So Aya, I wish, one of my greatest regrets is that I never took Poetry for the People at UC Berkeley when I was a student there. June Jordan was the professor back then. And it's so exciting to hear that you are now teaching it. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and maybe how it's informed your own writing and what that's been like?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing that I want to say is that I actually am also a lecturer at UC Berkeley, Go Union. And it's been as a lecturer that I've taught the class for the last 15 years. And I think, as I used to write a lot more poetry, now I'm pretty much exclusively writing fiction and essays. But the thing that it continues to be just so rich about the experience of Poetry for the People is the incredible blueprint that June Jordan left, which is about helping people who've been targeted by oppression and trauma to come to voice about their experiences. And this year I'm teaching some new classes, but really for like the 14 or 15 years before that, I taught the exact same classes every year. And yet it never got old because, we're here to talk about imagining a new world. And that also includes the transformation of individuals, and individuals that come from communities that have been affected by oppression. So there's just something really lovely and incredibly hopeful about every year having a new group of young people who have been affected by so many different types of trauma, all kind of fighting together as a team to help each other come to voice, to speak about what those experiences have been, to tell the truth, and to stand up for themselves and their communities, that the kinds of brutality that we're experiencing, we don't deserve, we've never deserved it, and that actually something else is possible.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I find that my students, when I was a teacher, my students just offered so much hope on a continual basis. So Aya, would you mind sharing a little of your own work?
Absolutely. So this is a snippet from my new book that's coming out in late December. It's called A Spy in the Struggle. It's my first standalone novel, and it's about the FBI infiltration of an African-American eco-racial justice organization in the Bay Area. And the book is told from the perspective of the FBI infiltrator. So this is from A Spy in the Struggle, and it takes place during a big protest of Randell Labs, which is the kind of the bad guy biotech corporation in this imaginary black town past Richmond on the BART line. So this is from A Spy in the Struggle. In the background, Yolanda could hear the crowd singing, "People gonna rise like the water, gonna calm this crisis down. I hear the voice of my great-granddaughter saying, keep it in the ground." On the far end of the park, several of the teenagers from Red, Black, and Green had created a makeshift stage by standing on a picnic table and were addressing the crowd through a bullhorn. Behind them, the concrete back of another building marked the unyielding perimeter of the park. The people, what? United, what? Will never be defeated. That's right, the people. They chanted on for a while, and then a young Latina climbed onto the picnic table and led the chant in Spanish. El pueblo, what? Unido, what? Jamás será vencido. I said the people, what? The young woman handed the bullhorn to Darnell, who began to beatbox, vocalizing a rhythm to go with the chant as she and another girl screamed the words from the picnic table. When the crowd heard the beat, they roared with approval. Two young men next to Yolanda began to dance in an undulating break rhythm that made their bodies look boneless and impervious to gravity. Next, Dana had the bullhorn and she addressed the crowd. Every year, our community has more climate refugees. We're sick of corporations like Randell getting rich off the destruction of the environment and the destruction of our people. We demand accountability for the death of Anitra Jenkins. Black Lives Matter. The crowd exploded with applause. They were interrupted by a booming voice over a loudspeaker. This is the Holloway Police Department. You are participating in an unlawful assembly and you need to disperse immediately. I repeat, disperse immediately. A cordon of police began to march from the Randell lot in full riot gear. Yolanda froze. What the hell was happening? The picketers were backing away from the cops, signs in hand. Fuck the police! A young man's voice came over the red, black, and green bullhorn, suddenly small and tinny compared to the police loudspeaker. The young black man, someone Yolanda didn't recognize, had grabbed the microphone from Nikisha. She was fighting to get it back, two handfuls of his jacket in her fists. Marcus grabbed hold of the bullhorn. This is a peaceful and nonviolent protest, he began yelling into it. We didn't come here today to make any trouble with the police. We came to demand justice for Anitra Jenkins. Over 100 camera phones were out recording. The young man who had yelled, "Fuck the police," began shoving his way through the crowd. The ripples pushed out toward the edges of the crush of people, sending one young white woman stumbling toward the police, her phone out and recording. An officer took out his nightstick and clubbed her in the head. The phone fell out of her hand as she threw her arms up to protect herself, and the crowd surged back in panic, pushing back to the concrete wall at the far end of the park. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I loved how your reading matched your background. Great. Well, I can't wait to talk more about protest and demonstration. But before we do that, I'd like to move on to Ishmael. Ishmael, just to talk a little bit about when I remember last seeing you, it was at a book event with Bharati Mukherjee. It was years ago, and you were one of the presenters. And I remember instead of reading, you took out some records and you played us some records, and it was great. It was like this record listening party. Mm-hmm. And that was such a wonderful experience. And it reminded me of the how interwoven different art forms are, and how we can be inspired by things that are not writing, not literature. So I'm wondering right now, what is inspiring you? What are there art forms? Is there a writer? Is there something out in the world that's really lighting?
Well, I'm doing my own work. I have an excerpt of a play mm-hmm. called "The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda" in the latest issue of Harper's Magazine. And I've been commissioned by the Los Angeles Philharmonic to do a work. So I'm pretty busy. My new book, Why the Black Hole Sings the Blues, will be out next month, and the play will be out next month. So I'm sort of absorbed my own work. I have a bestseller at Audible called Malcolm and Me, about my meeting Malcolm X in 1962. And I just sold another piece, a short story, 10,000 words, which takes place in 18th century Germany. All about fools, called A Fool Who Thought Too Much.
Great. And would you like to share a little bit of something that you've written? One of them.
Well, I taught at Berkeley incidentally for 35 years. I'm now teaching at the California College of the Arts, which keeps my poetry chops up. So this is my latest piece. It's called The Luckiest People in the World. And people have called this, because of the wealth and income inequality and the 1% and all that, a new Gilded Age 2. So this is called The Luckiest People in the World. Members of the Gilded Age 2, a hard time for you is not having enough kegs for your fraternity party, or hearing that your luxury cruise has been canceled, while our ancestors had to go without beer and didn't come over here on yachts. They weren't part of no regatta. They came in slave ships and coffin ships. A hard time for you is when others are crowding out your bandwidth, but suppose that you were a Mexican-American citizen sent across the border because Herbert Hoover blamed you for his depression. Or how about a Guatemalan child thrown in a cage and separated from its parents permanently? If this happened to your child, you'd be in a rage. Members of the Gilded Age, too, if you think that things are bad now because the price on your high-tech stocks dipped, imagine that you're a Chinese girl kidnapped and sold on the streets of San Francisco. It's 1860, and the 6 companies let strangers mangle you for 75 cents. Yet you're upset because your spouse's Chanel wasn't delivered in time for the dog show. Members of the Gilded Age, too, what about the other channel, the one taken by an immigrant in a leaking boat that was supposed to take him from Libya to Italy, and the boat capsizes, and all he sees are black fins swimming toward his children? Channel that. Members of the Gilded Age, hell, if you times get tough, you have Club, DoorDash, or Walmart can get your groceries in 2 hours. When you reach for the peach Melba, think of the long lines of cars as people await their food allotments. And it's 95 degrees, and your children didn't eat yesterday, and you've been unemployed for a year, and the nurses working at a nearby hospital have to use trash bags instead of gowns because the government believes that COVID is a Chinese hoax. If you think you got it bad, suppose you were an inmate in San Quentin and COVID is jumping from cell to cell after having left a nursing home. The end of those for those who fought 2 wars and survived depressions. Think of this as you put on your $100 designer mask over your nose and chin. Your daughter has to attend a state school because she was turned down by Princeton. Girls in other countries get acid thrown in their faces if found reading books, or they're too busy because they're too busy being slaves in India, Africa, and cases even pop up in the United States. From time to time, isn't she better off than those kidnapped by Boko Haram or ISIS or another group of overarmed idiots high on testosterone, smelling themselves, roaming the world, looking for a fight? Americans, even though you are led by an over-the-hill vaudevillian who has a hole in the sole of his soft shoe and streaks of makeup on his collar and lacks grog and is trailed by a roll of toilet paper as he boards Air Force One, even though your lead evangelists romp from motel to motel in their underwear, even though some Boy Scout leaders and some Catholic bishops get off on children. Members of the Gilded Age, too, unlike the people of the rest of the world, who hold their children as they starve in their arms, who drink from water that animals and humans defecate in, whose lands have become deserts and sink underwater because of your insatiable greed for toxic energy, you live a charmed life. You always win the lottery, the daily double, 3 bells in a row at Las Vegas, yet you whine, grouse, bitch, and moan when your lives are mirrored in the Streisand song. You are the luckiest people in the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was great. And said so much about the relativity of struggle, the relativity of inequity, and what we see as privilege and luck. Thank you for that. And moving on to Annalee. So Annalee, a lot of your writing takes on issues of science and the intersections between science and culture and technology. I'm wondering, for your fiction, do you really draw on that side of your writing life, or do you try to create separate worlds? How do they inform each other or not inform each other?
They mix promiscuously in my head. I definitely am one of those. There's kind of this cliche in the science fiction writers community that, you read a scientific paper or a scientific article and you're like, by George, I must write a story about it. Well, that happens to me. And a lot of my fiction is based on the fact that as a journalist, I absolutely have to tell the truth. I have to fact check everything. I have to also think about, protecting sources and, if they're doing something that's maybe, let's say a little outside the law in order to do something good for people. I'm not going to report that necessarily quite in that way. And so I kind of store up all of these stories and ideas I have that are not factual and pour them into my fiction. And so I love to think about the social implications of new technologies. And also, a lot of my characters are scientists who are trying to make the world better in some way, whether that's by delivering expensive medicines to frontline communities, or in the case of my latest novel, Future of Another Timeline, they're academic time travelers, and they're feminists and LGBT, and they're trying to change the timeline to make it better for people like themselves and for other marginalized folks. So it's kind of, I think, there's a joy in journalism where you get to know that you're telling the truth and you can help people understand the reality of the physical world. And but then it means that you have to leave out all of this social fabric that's so important to how we experience science, and it's so important to how science actually moves through the world. Science is shaped by capitalism and by racism and by all of the other things that shape our social lives and crush our lives. So that's, fiction is a big liberation for me. But I do have a firm brick wall in my head between what's fact and what's fiction. But maybe it's permeable.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The permeable wall of fact and fiction that comes up again and again.
Yeah.
So Annalee, would you mind sharing a little of your work with us?
Sure. I'm going to read just a little bit from The Future of Another Timeline, which came out late last year. I haven't been a lecturer at Berkeley for a very, very long time. But of course, many of my characters are academics, because I think you never quite are not an academic. You just become a recovering academic. So that's kind of where I am now. And this novel is an alternate history because of the fact that it's a world where time travel has always existed. So people are constantly editing the timeline and going back and forth. And in this alternate history, in the wake of the Civil War, Congress declared universal suffrage. So freed slaves were given the vote, and women. And so Harriet Tubman became a senator, as she richly deserved to do. And as a result, in this alternate history, feminism is much more intersectional at a very early point. But other things happen. There's backlashes that we don't have in this timeline. And so that's what these characters are dealing with. My main character is a geoscientist who travels through time. And they're geoscientists because time machines were found in ancient rocks. So that just becomes the academic world's way of talking about time travel. So this is a scene where she's meeting with a secret group of feminist time traveling academics. Geoscientists of the early 21st century eventually settled on the theory that small things change in history, but big things don't. trying to cause a significant divergence in the timeline was simply bad science, a honeypot for fools and failing tyrants. It was also against Chronology Academy regulations. The Daughters of Harriet, that's our radical group, the Daughters of Harriet had a different theory. Call it a hypothesis if you must. Geologists agreed that the timeline was constantly in flux. Travelers exposed to edits returned with memories of lost histories, previous versions of the timeline they had witnessed. Agents and corporate operatives occasionally alluded to covert missions to shift the balance of power. Even ancient scrolls contained references to travelers offering magical revelations that changed people's fates. It seemed obvious to the daughters that we lived in a heavily edited timeline and that small changes could add up to something bigger. One did not admit that at academic conferences, however, so we had a cover story. The Daughters of Harriet had an official name, the Applied Cultural Geology Group, with the mandate to observe major social transformations as they happened in the past. We'd been recognized as a legitimate scholarly organization by the American Geophysical Union, which made it easier to apply for grants and to schedule trips on the machines. Every month, we had a research meeting at my best friend Anita's house in Brentwood, close to the UCLA campus where we worked. There, we did a lot more than share discoveries and scotch. We made plans to edit history. We always started by going around the circle, describing lost histories that we remembered. There were many events that existed only in our memories because we had been present for the edits. Anita looked up from the tablet where she kept our changelog and spoke. I remember abortion being legal in the United States. There were a couple murmurs of Me Too. It was unusual for multiple people to remember a deleted event. Anita thought this meant that the change to abortion's legal status was the product of multiple edits and reversions. Its effects felt by many travelers exposed to the various edits as they took. I wasn't one of them. Like nearly everyone on the planet, I had no memories of legal abortion in the United States. She's going to change that.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Annalee. That was really powerful. I want to talk to all of you about the topic that we're here to discuss today, the idea of envisioning a new future. And I'm interested to know what this actually means to each of you, because it's a broad topic and the future means different things to us. And if we're thinking of social equity, social justice, that also is a broad topic that means different things to different people. So I'm interested to know, let's start with Aya. Aya, what does social equity or social justice look like for you? And particularly in your fiction, what are the issues that you really prioritize?
Well, for me, I think social justice and social equity, I'm writing stories about women of color. Usually I'm writing about poor and working class women of color, mostly Black and Latina in the African diaspora. That's kind of my wheelhouse. And, so just the very fact that I'm writing about these women's lives with them in the center is pushing for a different kind of visibility. I write heist. I have a 4-book heist series, and I write heist because it's about redistribution of wealth and not waiting. So I believe in legislation. I believe in social movements. But this is a form of direct action where these folks aren't waiting for the social movement to affect policy or for legislators to make it happen. They are stealing the money from the corrupt corporation CEO types who have stolen it from our communities. They're stealing it back and they're redistributing it in a number of different ways. And so that's in my Justice Hustler series. Also in that particular series, a lot of the women are sex workers. And one of the things that they're doing in terms of women's health is they run a clinic for sex workers and in the economy for a lot of the reasons that you were talking about in your piece, Annalee, right? Those kinds of attacks on women's healthcare, because women's healthcare in so many ways is kind of the foundation of liberation, has to do with body autonomy and being able to decide, what you do with your body. Because of the attacks on healthcare, they literally have had to turn to a life of crime to keep their clinic open. So, that's part of what I'm looking at there. And sex work is at this intersectional spot of race, class, gender, sexuality, desire, commerce, capitalism, nation. And that's a spot that I like to write. But I think, for me, in the past few years, the other thing that's just been critical is the climate crisis, right? So the book that I had that came out last year, Side Chick Nation, was the first novel published about Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And even though it was like a feminist heist story, I still figured out how to center it on the hurricane, because for me, climate is not just this urgent, complete and utter desperate danger, the climate crisis facing the world, but the solutions, as Varshini Prakash was saying recently with their book that's come out, Winning the Green New Deal, How We Can and Why We Must, the solutions to climate are actually the solutions to everything, because everything here is so interconnected, right? So the climate crisis has been brought to us by the same people who brought us white supremacy, who brought us patriarchy, who brought us Christian dominance, and the idea that we can just take dominion over this nature that these Native Americans were squandering, and we'll just make it work for us and exploit, has led us to this point where we are in crisis at every level. The uprising for Black Lives in response to the crisis of white supremacy, the climate crisis is happening. And so I look at things like the Green New Deal or even defunding police as these really powerful intersectional solutions, because the police are not keeping us safe. The police are protecting property, which is their actual job, which is why they, come out of the slave patrols, because the original property that they were protecting was us. They were making sure that we stayed enslaved. And so the idea that we would defund police and take huge amounts of resources out of policing and reinvest them in communities would completely transform what our urban environments and even some smaller environments looked like. Just like the Green New Deal would completely transform our economy, moving from this kind of death fossil fuel economy into a more equitable economic picture with a just transition from a fossil fuel economy to a renewable economy. And then the other things that I just think need to go in there too have to do with gender and care, right? What we call women's work, that we need to envision a future where work is distributed more equitably and all work that people do is with respect and dignity and living wages. And finally, also disability justice, because the way that capitalism works is that those who are not able-bodied and able to have certain kinds of productive and money-making labor extracted from them are considered disposable. And so if we were to create the kind of society that saw everyone as inherently valuable and figured out how people could make contributions that weren't based on this extractive capitalism, then, that would also be very powerful in terms of disability justice for people with disabilities and chronic health issues who, because the kind of go, extract isn't good for any of us, right, even though a lot of us are trying to pretend that we can play it off. So that kind of society would be equitable for everyone and for the planet. And I'm all for it.
Yeah, it's always fascinating how much intersectionality there is between all of these issues that we're wrangling with these days. So Ishmael, I'd like to know about your work. It sounds like you have a lot of things going on right now. You're working on a lot of different projects. Thinking about one of them, if you want to choose one of them to talk about, what are the issues you're wrangling with yourself in your fiction right now?
Well, I decided that in order for me as a Black male writer to survive in this country, I had to go global. And so my breakthrough occurred with a novel called Japanese by Spring. And I studied Japanese. And although the novel received a lukewarm reception here, it invited a lot of writers in Japan, readers in Japan and China. So I was able to go to Japan a couple of times. And recently I've gone to China, where my book has become a national project, which means that the government pays for the study of the book. And my novels and nonfiction books are being translated over there. So since March, I've been published in Haaretz in Israel, Liberation in Paris. El País invited me to write about the second largest newspaper in Spain, invited me to write about the Black Lives Matter. And I have trouble in the United States because when we talk about future, the problem I run into is that people don't know about the past. And that encompasses the intelligentsia, which is run by people of the same background. We have an op-ed and opinion industry, which is as huge as General Motors, and it's dominated by people from the same background. And there have been a lot of studies and reports written about the domination of the media, Hollywood, television, newspapers, by these people. So, for example, the New York Times, there's very little room for women and blacks on the editorial page, same people. Like Brent Stevens and Tom Friedman and people like that. Paul Krugman is an exception, but some of those people outright quacks who believe in race science, like David Brooks. He hangs out with race science quacks. And they had last week they had a very beautiful article about Andrew Sullivan, who is a fan of The Bell Curve, that book by Charles Murray, that was financed by the Pioneer Fund. So I wish everybody would Google the Pioneer Fund. It's a Nazi front. And it was founded by a man one of whose friends was hanged in Nuremberg, in the Nuremberg trial. So that's the sort of like attitude that is behind the sort of Republican policies that we're being hammered by. So I got stuck at the Washington Post. I had one of these, what I call an honorary feminist, usually guys from other ethnic groups who blame feminism and misogyny on black guys, but they won't talk about how they treat women in their ethnic groups. So this guy in the Washington Post, an honorary black feminist who doesn't talk about how women in his background are treated, his ethnic group, tried to drive a wedge between me and then Tozaki Shange. I was the first one to publish Color Girls, 1984. I was the first one to publish an excerpt from Color Girls. It became very famous, and we were friends. I mean, I talked to her weekly during the year before her death. And so the Washington Post had to apologize to me because the family wrote and said that I was her champion. So I said, wow, I got their attention. Maybe I'll write an op-ed for the Washington Post. So Andrew Jackson is admired among circles and the leadership in Washington, D.C. So I said, maybe I have a chance to inform them about some other atrocities committed by Andrew Jackson. Like he was responsible for the death of 370 men, women, and children, black men, women, and children, at what they call Fort Negro. The Native Americans and blacks took over this fort in Florida. And even though it was Spanish territory, Andrew Jackson ordered the invasion of it because he said these black fugitive slaves are giving other slaves ideas. He was a slave owner after all, and they have a statue to him all over the country. I said, wow, this is something that's fresh. I don't think the Washington Post has, covered this before. Well, they turned it down. So I get nothing but rejection slips in this country. So I have to go abroad. I call it my global strategy because people in the intelligentsia who run the country, or at least run the opinion industry, find my stuff hard to take. As a matter of fact, one of them said that reading me is like having a kidney stone. So that's my strategy. I think that all writers from our backgrounds, multicultural writers from different ethnic groups, try to expand your readership because it's all rigged here. there's still, I was reading one of a 19th century poet who talked about how difficult it was for her to find a way to read and write because there was such a suppression going on in the South at that time. And there was like a prohibition against black people reading and writing. She talked about all the subterfuge they had to use to learn letters. Okay, so that's still the situation where you might have a renaissance, as black writers and multicultural writers are undergoing a renaissance right now. But because of the people who filter, or the middle persons whose job is to translate or explain Blacks, Latinx, Native Americans, and other Asian Americans to a white reading public, only 2 or 3 get through. And what happens is when they get tired of them or they become rebellious, they get rid of them. That's what happened to James Baldwin. I have a hard time explaining to people that during Baldwin's time, there were black men and women writers who just as good or better. I just have a hard time explaining that to liberals, okay? For example, Margaret Walker. Margaret Walker wrote a masterpiece, Jubilee. It's right there with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. As a matter of fact, the 2 novels should be taught in tandem in classrooms. You know, one from the outside point of view, one who's an insider. Margaret Walker was relying upon, the oral tradition of her family. There were a lot of writers around but Baldwin had, the literary establishment back him, Partisan Review. They ordered him to hit Richard Wright. He hit Chester Himes. So the token always has to hit the writers who are his peers in his ethnic group. I was on a panel with a Native American writer said he's the only writer Native American who can write. I said, what about Leslie Silko? What about Joy Harjo? He didn't realize that I knew all these people. So that's what we're condemned to in this country. Only a few can get through. Mm-hmm. Okay? Just realize that. And the way to expand your readership is to look for a global audience. So my last novel was called Conjugating Hindi. I study Hindi, and it's about the clash between a right-wing Indian American and a black American. Of course, they become friends at the end, really realizing that they're confronted by the same issues. That's been ignored here, but it was received very well in India by Pakistani and Indian critics. So I think that's a strategy that all of us have to adhere to instead of auditioning to be nominated for the National Book Award, or auditioning to make nice and not move on, or move on and say and reconcile all that stuff, or sell indulgences. That's a big racket. You remember in the early church, they used to sell indulgences. Like, if you pay somebody some money, they see that you're only in purgatory for a year or something. So I see that as a racket right now where people explaining, there's a whole industry of people explaining stuff to the white readership. They should find out themselves what's going on around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like it's...
Instead of leading safari and showing people, the tribes, we're still treated as tribes. We're still treated as members of tribes, like a newly discovered tribe in the Amazon or somewhere, and we need anthropologists to explain us to people.
It sounds like it's time to start looking beyond the sort of tokens and totems that are being offered to us by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by whoever controls the narrative of the media. Yeah, that's really important. Thank you, Ishmael. Mm-hmm. Annalee, let's talk about the issues that you try to take on in your fiction. Your journalism is very issue based. I'm wondering in your fiction, how does social justice, social equity come through?
Yeah, it's really fundamental to the work that I'm doing in fiction. As I said earlier, it's a lot harder in journalism to take a strong position, partly for a lot of the reasons that Ishmael is describing, and also because the limitations of nonfiction writing. And so one of the issues that has emerged in my journalism over the past, 20 years has been a concern over property and a concern over who owns the results of scientific research, And so in my fiction, I just fill it up with all that shit. Like, it's just all about like who owns science. I'm so glad that Ishmael brought up the bell curve, which was actually produced by researchers at Berkeley, and is one of the pieces of writing that I think has done the most damage to science, basically, to the way that we understand evolution, to the way that we understand how brains work. It's basically, it's the classic kind of racist, scientific racism, which, wants to rank each ethnic group as if they're separate species and put them on a hierarchy. And so in my science fiction, one of the things that I've dealt with again and again is who gets to count as a person, and how do we use intellectual authority and how do we use science to kind of justify who we're counting as a person and who gets to have rights. And so in my first novel, Autonomous, it's set about 150 years in the future, and it's about how clever corporate lawyers managed to essentially reinvent slavery by creating laws around indenture. And the idea is that these are the laws, of course, are written as, these are, freedom to be indentured laws. You're free to sell your labor and get all of this great treatment, because if you sell yourself to someone for 10 years, they'll give you a bed and give you food. Doesn't that sound great? And so the way that these lawyers are able to do this, we discover throughout the course of the book, which is about a pirate who is stealing medicine and redistributing it, and the robot who's been sent to track her down and kill her, the robot from this from this company that makes pharmaceuticals. And so we discover that lawyers have, there's been this robot civil rights movement in the past, and robots have successfully asserted that they are human equivalent and they deserve rights. But there's this pushback from corporations saying like, well, but if someone pays to build the robot, shouldn't the robot pay them back for that cost by being indentured for 10 years? And so this legislation gets pushed through. And then this is the capper, because if robots are human equivalent and robots can be indentured, shouldn't people have the right to be indentured also? So that's how we get to the sort of situation in Autonomous, and where the characters are dealing with questions around who gets to be owned as a person, but also who gets to own these medicines that these companies are making and that people desperately need to survive. And a lot of these same questions haunt Future of Another Timeline, which is in some ways a lot less fantastical. There's no robot characters, although they do travel through time, which, by the way, is totally not scientific, it turns out. We're never going to be able to travel through time except through things like the 1619 Project, which is basically kind of what my characters are trying to do, but in real life. And so, again, it's all about sort of who gets to have their version of events turned into official history, and what counts as an important historical figure. And the big debate between the characters is always whether history is guided by so-called great men or whether it's guided by social movements. And of course, my heroes kind of believe in the social movement stuff, but there's also something to be said for the idea that there's some great, terrible men who are pushing history usually in the wrong direction, but occasionally in the right direction. So really, I think my two obsessions are who gets to claim authority and what kinds of tricks they use to do it, whether they call upon intellectual authority of science or whether they call upon this kind of rational notion of economics. Like, well, it just makes good sense that we should have some people be indentured. I mean, that's just a good, healthy economy. Plus, why don't you read the bell curve? It shows that these people are just too dumb to really know the difference. And I'm saying it in my funny racist uncle voice, but like, this is, as Ishmael was saying, this is public policy right now, and I can easily see it getting, in the years to come, this is going to become a much more bloody and dangerous fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This idea of who gets to claim authority and who gets to convey information, who the distributors are of information and of of rectitude and logic. This is such a question of power in today's society. And I'm thinking of something you said a couple minutes ago. I've never been told so forthrightly that time travel will never happen. I'm kind of crushed.
Yeah, sorry. I talked to a bunch of physicists before I started the book because I was like, okay, I'm going to have the most realistic time travel you've ever seen. It's going to be totally scientifically accurate. And they were like, sorry. And actually one guy I talked to, Adam Becker, he said, look, time travel is not a scientific device. It's a literary device. And just go with it. Just let yourself make a literary device. And I was like, okay, science has told me it's okay to have a literary device. So,
yeah, it's the fiction part of science fiction.
Yeah.
Speaking of time travel, a question for all of you. When we think about re-envisioning a future, so often I'll read a book that seems to have been written by a psychic because it will be telling the story of something that is happening like right in front of my eyes in the news. But I know as a writer that book was written like 4 years ago, maybe longer. And I feel like writers in many ways can come across as fortune tellers, as people who see a future and predict it and then put it into story. So I'm wondering, Aya, let's go back to you. Is there a book that has really spoken to you, like has seemed to predict something that you saw in the future? Or is there something in your own writing that maybe unintentionally predicted a future?
Well, I mean, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, the book that just bam comes to mind right now is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, right? And so I want to get their name right. The folks with Extinction Rebellion in New York are doing like a book study of it right now. I mean, it's just sort of shocking. She predicted this right down to the Make America Great Again slogan with, Los Angeles being, deeply impacted by the climate crisis. So, that book is just right in our faces right now. And I think that, for me, the battle to remove Trump, I don't usually say his name, I put a little asterisk in it when I write it, but the battle to remove him is kind of the battle for the soul of our nation right now. And, and our nation as this really major colonial, economic, and military power, it's not really just our nation. It's about the damage that he and his administration and party have done and can continue to do in the world that we need to stop. So I feel like that battle is just so key right now. So her ability to predict that in the future so particularly is powerful. And yet I think, all of these things have cycles, right? So I think that ability to see the future is really about seeing the cycle. And, many people have been looking at these different cycles. We saw Obama and then what is the backlash? So I'm ready for the backlash to the backlash to the backlash, which, we were seeing some of in terms of the success of the Sanders campaign with, and just, I am hoping that we are moving in the direction of defunding police and the Green New Deal. The other thing I'll just say is I also really appreciate the it's not going to happen hard stop with time travel. I was just sort of messaging with Annalee that I also am just starting to work on a time travel novel. And, with them, it wasn't rocks, it was fire. It had to do with heat, right? So that you needed a certain kind of amount of fire to time travel, but you didn't want to burn up the people that were traveling. You had to figure that part out. But I do think that there's something so fascinating about time travel because of all the things that you were talking about in your, novel, right? About memory. What I have going is this mother-daughter thing where the daughter has to go back in time to help the mom deal with some racial trauma, because basically when the mom was younger, there wasn't as clear of an understanding of the emotional impact of racism. And she's traumatized and in the present is stuck and unable to do something that's needed to save the family. So the daughter goes back in time to help the mom cope with the trauma. And I think it's connected to what you were talking about, Ishmael, just, like this persistent brutality of racism in the United States, whereby, kind of generation after generation sort of gets ground down by it, which is why it's so important to have intergenerational solidarity. And I think it's also why it's so important, like we were talking about earlier, with young people and hopefulness, which is why it's also important for those of us who are older to, listen and follow the lead of younger people politically, like the Sunrise Movement, like Youth versus Apocalypse in Oakland, like, just these different, like the movement for Black Lives, these younger generations who are more unapologetic and fierce in terms of how they're demanding that we move forward into the future.
And speaking of moving forward, we're being sort of deluged with issues right now in our world. And I'm wondering, just moving over to Annalee for a moment, Annalee, how do you get past the sort of constant onslaught of news and issues? And as someone who writes about issues of today, how do you focus on one and not feel overwhelmed and plug into your work and move into it with focus?
Well, there's really two parts to that, to this answer, right? Because part of it is, a little bit what I was talking about, where there's a psychological aspect to doing this kind of work. There's like having to, deal with trauma and how do you kind of get your way through that trauma and then find your voice and say something that you think will help other people, hopefully help other people get over their trauma, but also take action, and I really think that, for me, one of the things that keeps me going, especially in the last couple months, has been feeling like this is my way of having direct action. And this is my way of, raising my voice and making as much of a noise as I can and hoping that, I can grab other people's hands and pull them with me. So I actually do write for the New York Times op-ed section, which I agree has many problems. And I think a lot of us who write for it feel ambivalent. We do have great writers like Jamel Bowie, who just wrote a fantastic, amazing piece a couple days ago about why Facebook needs to die, and how Facebook is basically is creating the equivalent of like toxic waste, but in a psychological and political sense, by fomenting all of this hate and conspiracy theory activity online. So I think, one of the things that people keep quoting about Ruth Bader Ginsburg is that she always said that her dissenting opinions were kind of letters to the future, and that she hoped that her dissents would one day kind of form the bedrock for new kinds of legal decisions that would be more equitable or more just. And so that's kind of, that's what I have to tell myself to get out of bed is like, okay, one day maybe someone will read this and say, oh, so not everyone in the 21st century was completely fucked. That's cool. Like there was a movement, And I think that's why it's so important to look back on history. And a lot of my work deals with history. My next book, For Lost Cities, is about archaeology. And it's looking at new archaeological discoveries in ancient cities, and specifically focusing on the experience of slaves and working people and women, many of whom were all in the same category. So there's a Venn diagram there. But it's, there's a turn toward, in this academic work, there's a turn toward trying to understand what ordinary people were doing, the people who were building these cities and who were in fact part of social movements. Even in, very ancient times, there were movements to, abolish slavery. There were movements to lift up freed slaves and help them become politicians in ancient Rome, for example. So we have to remember, like, our ancestors speak to us through these words, and we can hopefully communicate to our progeny about, this is a fight that's ongoing, and we were here with you. You're walking our path, and there is hope. Hopefully there is hope. She said tautologically, but yeah, I mean that's all you can really do, is to keep yelling.
So speaking of hope, Ishmael, in our last minute or so, can you offer some hope to writers who are really just trying to do the good work now and envision this better future and write towards it?
We began the Before Columbus Foundation in 1976, and this year we have announced our awards. I think that we should, those of us who have some space and who get published, should bring others along. That was the idea of founding the Before Columbus Foundation. I've had op-eds published in the New York Times since the 70s and had one last month. But I'd like to see more people, not just the tokens like Charles Blow or some of the others who are just tokens. As a matter of fact, the women write better than the men. Maureen Dowd and the other women write better than men on that page. So I think all of us who have been, like, I admit I'm a token. I get mentioned a lot. I get a lot of space. We should bring other people along. And I think we should start questioning intersectionality. And I'll just end with this. I have a piece coming out in the Chronicle tomorrow about how Black people and their movements have brought everybody along. Asian Americans, Latinx, women, I mean, everybody comes along on the coattails of Blacks, okay? But then they go right on us. I mean, progressives go right wing on us. And people say that they don't know us, even though, it was these movements that propelled them into prosperity. Now, I'm glad you mentioned Bharati Mukherjee, because she was one of those intellectuals, gifted novelists, who acknowledged the fact that the Black movement brought her to what she became, like a prosperous, a well-known novelist living in the United States. Another is Elizabeth Nunez. You should read her work. She's masterful. She's a Trinidadian American, and she says the same thing. But other people don't know us. Like a Chinese American judge told me that without the civil rights movement, he would remain in the ghetto. And they'll say that. So one last thing. A very good friend of mine said that he had gotten an advancement because of the killing of George Floyd. That was a Black guy. This guy's not a traditional African American. So I just think if we talk about intersectionality, don't forget the people who brought you to the party.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know my family wouldn't be here without the civil rights movement. Thank you for that, Ishmael. Aya, you wanted to say one last thing to cap us off here.
I think hope is the key issue here. And I think it's the key issue in this election year. It's not, I want to make it really clear, it's not about how voting will rescue us from all these problems. No, voting will create a set of conditions where the movements that we are building will be able to bring us to where we need to go. But under the current administration, the conditions for us organizing for big solutions are so impacted by the level of trauma and extraction that's happening, and the robber baron capitalism, the viciousness, the children in cages, every day a new horror. But the biggest thing that these folks count on, which is why white terrorism and gender terrorism are so important, is that they literally terrify us. They make us feel small. They make us feel afraid. They make us feel like we can't do it. They not only discourage people from voting, but they discourage people from any kind of activism or raising their voices. And that's why it's so important, I believe, that not only do we look at the present moment, but the kind of society that we have that so silences and mistreats communities, and really mistreats young people in all the communities, regardless of the economic resources that they have. It really installs these buttons in us where we just shrink and we wait to see what's going to happen. What's someone else going to do? Like, is the big scary guy gonna like trash the house, or is he gonna go away? And actually what we need to do now is we all need to step up into our power. And the hope really comes from us fighting any old demons that we have to step up to be powerful now. And in the next however long between now and the election is one critical time where we all need to stand against those stories of trauma that we have, that we can't do it and we can't win and we're not powerful enough. We are, and I have this piece that I wrote called Joe Biden Can Be My Uber Driver. And it's because Uber, like the Democratic Party, is a very flawed organization. But Joe Biden isn't the guy I'm expecting to lead me. He's just the guy who's going to drive us to where we're trying to go. So he's a good Uber driver for me. Come look and ride shotgun. It's all good. But I think that there's a way that we've got to stop looking for someone to rescue us and start looking to our movement and start looking to this election as a critical turning point where we really can begin turning everything around.
Absolutely. So hope lies with us, not with one judge, not with one president.
That's right.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you for your words and your thoughts and your literature today. That's all for us for today. I want to thank again Aya De Leon, Annalee Newitz, and Ishmael Reed for joining us. We hope you'll keep watching throughout the day for more enlightening and powerful conversations. Up next at 2 p.m., we have a live conversation between two powerhouse intellectuals, Arlie Hochschild and John A. Powell. I'm Shanthi Sekaran, and you've been watching Berkeley Unbound, part of Bay Area Book Festival Unbound.